What's happening right now on the global stage is absolutely fascinating, and I need to break this down for you because mainstream media is not giving you the full picture. While everyone's distracted by the latest headlines, there's a massive geopolitical shift happening that's going to affect all of us, whether we realize it or not. So here's the situation. The United States is currently ramping up its aggressive posture around the world. We're talking increased sanctions on Venezuela, mounting pressure on Iran, and a generally more confrontational approach to international relations. Now, you might be thinking this is just typical American foreign policy, but here's where it gets interesting. China is watching all of this unfold, and they're playing a completely different game. While the U.S. is flexing military muscle and imposing economic penalties left and right, China is taking notes and doing the exact opposite. They're not trying to outmuscle America. Instead, they're positioning themselves as the calm, stable, predictable alternative to American power. And let me tell you, this strategy is absolutely brilliant. Let me explain what China's actually doing here. First, they're actively avoiding direct confrontations. Unlike the U.S. approach of threats and ultimatums, China is staying measured and diplomatic. Second, they're doubling down on economic diplomacy, which basically means using trade deals and investment as their primary tool for influence. And third, they're massively expanding their network of trade agreements and strategic partnerships across the globe. Now, why does this matter? Because there's a huge portion of the world, what we call the Global South, countries in Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East, that are absolutely exhausted by the unpredictability of American foreign policy. One administration comes in with one set of policies, the next administration tears up all those agreements and does something completely different. It's chaotic, it's unstable, and it makes long-term planning impossible for these countries. China saw this frustration and thought, we can offer something different. And that's exactly what they're doing. They're showing up with long-term infrastructure projects, stable trade relationships, and, crucially, no regime change operations or lectures about how these countries should run their governments. Whether you agree with this approach morally or not, from a pure strategic standpoint, it's incredibly effective. Let me give you some context about what this actually looks like on the ground. When the U.S. imposes sanctions on a country like Venezuela or Iran, those countries don't just disappear from the global economy. They need to trade, they need investment, they need partners. So, what happens? China steps in. They offer alternative payment systems that bypass the U.S. dollar. They invest in energy infrastructure. They provide the economic lifeline that these sanctioned countries desperately need. And here's the kicker. It's not just sanctioned countries. Even nations that have traditionally been in America's sphere of influence are starting to diversify their partnerships. Why? Because relying solely on the United States has become risky. When your entire economic relationship can be upended by a single election or policy shift in Washington, you start looking for backup options. China is positioning itself as that backup option, and increasingly, as the primary option for many countries. Now, analysts who study this stuff are identifying three major ways China benefits from this approach. First, they're expanding their geopolitical presence without firing a single shot. Chinese investment and trade deals are giving them influence in regions where they previously had minimal presence. We're talking about Africa, where China is now the largest trading partner for many countries. We're talking about Latin America, traditionally considered America's backyard, where Chinese investment is reshaping economies. Second, China is deepening alliances outside the Western axis. They're building an alternative network of partnerships that doesn't revolve around Washington, Brussels, or London. This includes organizations like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Belt and Road Initiative, and BRICS, which recently expanded to include several new members. These aren't just economic clubs, they're the foundation of an alternative power structure. Third, and this is crucial, China is positioning itself as a pillar of what they call a multipolar world order. What does that mean? Instead of a single superpower calling the shots, you have multiple power centers, each with their own sphere of influence. China isn't trying to replace the U.S. as the sole global hegemon. They're advocating for a world where multiple powers coexist and no single country dominates everyone else. The timing of all this is particularly sensitive. We're living through a period where energy security is paramount. Countries need reliable access to oil, natural gas, and other resources. When the U.S. takes aggressive action against major energy producers, whether it's Venezuela, Iran, or potentially others, it creates instability in global energy markets. Other countries look at this and think, we need to secure our energy future, and we can't rely on a system where one country can cut off supplies based on political disagreements. This is pushing nations that might have otherwise remained neutral closer into China's orbit. It's accelerating the competition for global leadership in ways that wouldn't have happened if the U.S. had maintained a more stable, predictable approach to international relations. So here's the bottom line of what's happening. The more the United States uses force, coercion, and unilateral action as its primary tools of foreign policy, the more space China finds to grow through exactly the opposite approach: diplomacy, trade, and what I call silent influence. They're not making big, loud declarations. They're quietly building relationships, signing agreements, and creating dependencies that will shape global politics for decades to come. In the next part, I'm going to dive deep into what this actually means for the future, the potential impacts we're going to see, and why this matters for everyday people like you and me, not just for politicians and academics. Welcome back. Now that we understand what's happening, let's talk about what it actually means. Because this isn't just some abstract geopolitical theory. This shift is going to have concrete impacts on economies, on international relations, and potentially on your daily life. Let me break down the major implications we're likely to see. First, let's talk about the global economic order. For the past 75 years, the U.S. dollar has been the world's reserve currency. What does that mean? It means international trade, especially oil, is primarily conducted in dollars. Countries need to hold dollar reserves. This gives the United States enormous power because controlling the currency everyone uses gives you leverage over the entire system. But here's what's changing. China, along with other countries frustrated by U.S. sanctions and financial pressure, is actively working to create alternatives to the dollar-dominated system. We're seeing the expansion of currency swap agreements, where countries trade directly in their own currencies without converting to dollars. We're seeing the increased use of China's yuan in international transactions. We're even seeing discussions about BRICS countries potentially creating their own currency for trade among members. Now, I'm not saying the dollar is going to collapse tomorrow. That's not what's happening here. But we are seeing the beginning of a gradual erosion of dollar dominance. Even a shift from, say, 90% of trade in dollars to 70% would represent a massive change in global power dynamics, and that shift creates opportunities for China to expand its influence through financial infrastructure. Second, let's consider the impact on global supply chains. Over the past few decades, we built a globalized economy based on the assumption of relative stability and cooperation between major powers. Companies spread their production across multiple countries to optimize costs. But when you have increasing U.S.-China tensions, countries being sanctioned, and the risk of economic warfare, that whole model becomes risky. What we are seeing now is countries trying to secure their supply chains by diversifying away from potential conflict zones. Some are reshoring production back home. Others are nearshoring, moving production to friendly neighboring countries. And many are creating redundant supply chains that don't rely on any single power's goodwill. China recognized this trend early and has been positioning itself as a reliable node in these new supply chain configurations, especially for countries in the global south. They're offering not just cheap manufacturing, but increasingly technology transfer, infrastructure development, and integration into a China-centered economic sphere. For countries that feel left out of Western-dominated supply chains, this is incredibly attractive. Third, there's the technology dimension. We're witnessing the emergence of parallel technology ecosystems. The U.S. and its allies are trying to restrict China's access to advanced semiconductors, AI technology, and other cutting-edge innovations. In response, China is massively investing in developing its own alternatives and offering these technologies to countries that might be cut off from Western sources. This means we could be heading toward a world where you have fundamentally different technology standards in different parts of the globe. Chinese 5G infrastructure in one region, Western infrastructure in another, different AI systems, different internet governance models, different digital payment systems. This fragmentation has profound implications for global connectivity and innovation. Now let's talk about what this means for international institutions. The post-World War II order was built around institutions like the United Nations, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, organizations largely shaped by and favorable to Western interests. China isn't necessarily trying to destroy these institutions, but they're creating parallel structures that offer alternatives. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, for example, is China's alternative to the World Bank. The Belt and Road Initiative creates infrastructure connections that don't rely on Western financing. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization provides a security framework outside NATO. These aren't just redundant organizations, they're the building blocks of an alternative international system. For smaller countries, this is actually beneficial in some ways. Having options means having leverage. If the IMF imposes conditions you don't like, maybe you can get financing from China instead. If Western countries impose sanctions, maybe you can trade with the Eastern Bloc. Competition between power centers can give smaller nations more agency than they'd have in a unipolar world. But there are serious risks, too. A fragmented world order increases the potential for miscalculation and conflict. When you don't have shared institutions and frameworks for resolving disputes, disagreements can escalate more easily. We could see the world dividing into competing blocs, each with its own rules, similar to the Cold War, but potentially more complex because it's not just two sides anymore. Let me address what this means for energy markets specifically, since that's a crucial part of this story. When the U.S. pressures major oil and gas producers, those producers need alternative customers. China, as the world's largest energy importer, is the obvious alternative. This gives China significant leverage over global energy flows. We are already seeing this play out. Chinese companies are increasing their presence in Venezuelan oil fields. China is a major customer for Iranian oil despite U.S. sanctions. They're investing heavily in renewable energy technology, positioning themselves to dominate the next generation of energy infrastructure. Whoever controls energy flows has geopolitical power, and China is systematically building that control. So what's the bottom line? We're witnessing a fundamental restructuring of global power. The unipolar moment, where the United States was the undisputed global superpower, is ending. We're moving into a multipolar world where China is a major pole of power, and the competition between these poles is intensifying. For the United States, the challenge is whether to adapt to this new reality or try to maintain primacy through increasingly aggressive means. The current approach of sanctions, pressure, and confrontation seems to be accelerating the very trend it's trying to prevent, pushing more countries toward China. For China, the opportunity is clear, but so are the risks. They're gaining influence, but they're also taking on responsibilities and potential conflicts that come with great power status. And for the rest of us, we're going to live in a more complex, more fragmented, but potentially more balanced world. Understanding these dynamics isn't just academic, it's essential for making sense of the changes coming our way. That's the reality of where we're headed. Thanks for watching.